It started with something so small I almost laughed it off. A thin gold bracelet on her wrist that I had never seen before. Not her style either, too delicate, too expensive looking, the kind of thing she usually said was wasteful. I remember asking her about it while she was standing in the kitchen scrolling her phone like nothing mattered. "Oh, this?" she said casually. "Just a gift from work." That should have been the end of it. It wasn't. Because a week later, I noticed a perfume bottle in her bag. Not hers. Not even close. Floral, heavy, expensive. I only knew because the smell lingered on her jacket, and I spent half the night trying to place it. At the time, I told myself I was being paranoid. We'd been together for years. Life had settled into something predictable, comfortable, even. Work, dinner, sleep, repeat. Nothing dramatic. Nothing worth doubting. But then the gifts kept appearing. Little things at first. Earrings. A scarf. A handwritten note folded too neatly to be accidental. And none of them were from me. I started paying attention after that, but quietly. Not in a confrontational way. More like I was watching a movie I suddenly didn't remember signing up for. She'd come home later than usual, always with a reason that sounded reasonable enough on its own. Meetings. Coworkers. You know how it is. And I didn't know. That's what made it harder. We had a rhythm, her and I, shared routines, shared silence. It used to feel like stability. Now it felt like camouflage. The gifts multiplied. A ring that wasn't a wedding ring, but sat on her finger like it belonged there. A silk tie tucked into her drawer that I had never worn, never bought. Once, I even found a concert ticket stub in her coat pocket for a show she told me she didn't care about. I remember holding it in my hand for a long time, just staring. The worst part wasn't the items themselves. It was how normal she acted while they accumulated around her like evidence she thought I'd never connect. Or maybe she knew I would. And just didn't care. The turning point wasn't dramatic. No shouting, no sudden confession. It was quieter than that, which somehow made it worse. I was doing laundry when I found another gift box tucked into the lining of her work tote. Small, velvet, unmistakably meant for jewelry. Inside was a necklace I had never seen before. Not something you'd casually pick up for yourself. It had intention behind it. My hands started shaking before I even closed the box. That night I didn't sleep. I kept replaying everything, every late night, every gift from work, every moment I had brushed off because trusting her felt easier than questioning her. The next morning, I did something I'm still not proud of. I checked her messages. I told myself I just needed clarity. Just proof that my mind wasn't inventing patterns where none existed. Instead, I found names. Multiple names. Some familiar from her work stories. Some completely unknown. And scattered between them, photos of gifts. The same kind of gifts I'd been finding at home. Sent with messages that weren't friendly. Not professional. Personal. The revelation didn't hit me all at once. It came in waves. The first wave was denial. I remember sitting on the edge of the bed thinking there had to be an explanation. Maybe misunderstandings. Maybe harmless flirting. People joked, people overstepped. But the second wave didn't care about my excuses. Because I saw the pattern. The consistency. The repetition. Different people, same type of attention. Same kinds of gifts. Like she was collecting versions of affection from everywhere she went, and bringing them home like nothing was wrong. I felt sick, but also strangely detached, like I was watching someone else's life collapse. When she came home that evening, I asked her about it directly. No build-up. No easing in. "Where did the necklace come from?" She froze for half a second too long. Then smiled. A smile I had seen too many times when she wanted something to disappear. "It's just a gift," she said again. But this time her voice didn't match her eyes. And I knew, in that moment, she wasn't going to tell me the truth easily. The conversation escalated faster than I expected. I showed her the box. Then the messages. One by one. My hands were steady, which surprised me more than anything else. Her reaction wasn't immediate denial. It was something worse, calculated silence. Then she said, "You went through my phone?" Not an apology. Not an explanation. Just that. We argued, but it wasn't really an argument. It was me trying to make sense of something she had already decided not to clarify. Eventually, she admitted enough to confirm what I already knew. Not everything. Just fragments. Enough to make me feel insane for not realizing sooner. "Yes, they gave me things," she said. "It wasn't what you think." But she wouldn't define what it was. Or what I was supposed to think. And the most devastating part was how calm she stayed. Like I was the one disrupting something normal. I remember sitting there thinking I had married someone I no longer recognized, and worse, someone who didn't think she needed to explain herself to me at all. After that night, everything became unstable. She started sleeping in another room without saying it directly. Just drifting there. Like we were already separated but hadn't signed the paperwork yet. I replayed conversations in my head constantly, searching for moments I missed. Clues I ignored. Signs I should have seen. But the truth is, there were too many versions of her depending on who she was with. And I think I only ever knew one of them. The worst part wasn't even the betrayal. It was realizing how easily I had accepted explanations that were designed to keep me from asking deeper questions. At work, I couldn't focus. At home, I couldn't breathe properly. Everything felt slightly unreal, like I was living inside a delayed reaction to something already finished. And still, the gifts kept appearing. Even after confrontation. As if nothing had changed except my awareness of it. That was the moment I realized this wasn't a mistake. It was a system. I started looking deeper. Not just at her things, but at timelines, patterns, inconsistencies. She wasn't hiding everything. That's what made it so complicated. She was selective. Strategic. Some messages were affectionate. Some were purely transactional. Some were from people I had never even heard mentioned before. It wasn't one betrayal. It was multiple overlapping ones. I remember sitting in the kitchen at 3 a.m., surrounded by printed screenshots like evidence in a case I never asked to investigate. My hands smelled like coffee I wasn't drinking. At one point, I actually tried to map it out on paper. Names. Dates. Gifts. Locations. And what I saw made me feel physically cold. Because it wasn't chaotic. It was organized. Which meant it had been happening for longer than I wanted to believe. And I had been living next to it the entire time, calling it marriage. The confrontation that followed wasn't clean. I asked her directly if she loved any of them. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she said something about needs, and attention, and not everything being black and white. I told her I wasn't asking for philosophy. That's when she broke character slightly. Not emotionally, but structurally, like a mask slipping just enough to show me there was another layer underneath. She said, "You wouldn't understand what it's like to feel unseen." That line stayed with me more than anything else. Because I had been there. I had seen her. Or I thought I had. But apparently, what I gave wasn't enough to keep her anchored. Or maybe anchoring wasn't something she wanted. The conversation ended without resolution. Just exhaustion. Two people standing in the same room with completely different realities of what that room meant. I stopped sleeping properly after that. Every sound in the house felt exaggerated. Every notification on her phone felt like another possibility I hadn't accounted for. She didn't leave. But she also didn't stay in any meaningful way. We became careful around each other, like strangers sharing space out of obligation. Friends noticed something was wrong before I told anyone. I didn't explain much. I couldn't. Not in a way that made sense. Because how do you explain that your entire relationship didn't collapse in a moment? It just gradually revealed it had never been what you believed. The gifts stopped coming for a while. Then resumed again, subtly. Different sources? Different names? Same pattern. And that's when I understood something I didn't want to accept. I wasn't dealing with a mistake. I was dealing with a behavior. Eventually, I confronted one of the people directly. It wasn't planned. I just needed to know what version of reality they were living in. What I got back was confusion. Then defensiveness. Then truth in pieces. They thought it was casual. That she was single, or almost single. That I was. Complicated history. Hearing that word, history, hit harder than anything else. Because I wasn't even present in their narrative. I was something already filed away. When I came home, she could tell something had changed. You talked to someone, didn't you? She asked. And I realized she wasn't surprised. Just irritated. Like I had broken an unspoken agreement. We tried therapy once. But it felt like walking into a room where all three of us were speaking different languages and pretending it was translation. The therapist asked simple things first. Timeline. Feelings. What brought us there? I answered like someone trying to build a coherent story out of broken glass. She answered selectively, carefully, like every word had to pass some internal filter before it was allowed out. And then the questions started getting uncomfortable. About boundaries. About honesty. About the other people. That's when she shut down, not emotionally at first, but structurally. Her posture changed. Her voice flattened. She said she didn't feel safe being judged. That word, judged, became her shield. Everything difficult could be placed behind it and dismissed. After the session, the therapist tried to redirect us, but she had already decided it wasn't going to continue. 2 sessions, that was it. She said it was unproductive. I remember sitting in the car afterward, not even angry, just hollow, like we had tried to operate a machine that was never designed to function between us. At home, things didn't improve. They just narrowed. Less conversation. Less conflict. Less explanation. Almost like emotional rationing. And the strangest part was how quickly she adapted to the absence of effort. Like she had been waiting for permission to stop pretending. That's when I realized something I didn't want to accept. She wasn't confused about what she was doing. She was selective about what she was willing to acknowledge. And I was still standing in the position of someone asking for clarity in a system that was never meant to provide it. The breaking point didn't come with shouting or discovery. It came with exhaustion. The kind that builds so slowly you don't notice it until you're already past the limit. Another gift appeared one evening. Just sitting on the kitchen counter like it belonged there, like it had always belonged there. No explanation. No note. Just another object with too much meaning attached to it. I didn't pick it up right away. I just stood there staring at it while she moved around the apartment behind me, completely aware I was looking at it but choosing not to acknowledge it first. Eventually, she sighed. Not surprised. Not confused. Just tired in a way that wasn't about the situation itself, but about my continued inability to accept it on her terms. That was the shift. I finally said, "Do you even hear yourself anymore?" She looked at me like I was the one complicating things unnecessarily. Like I was overinterpreting something that, in her mind, had already been normalized. We didn't escalate. That's what made it worse. No emotional peak, no dramatic break. Just a slow erosion of any remaining shared narrative. At one point she said, "You're making this bigger than it is." And I remember laughing, not because it was funny, but because I suddenly understood we were no longer arguing about events. We were arguing about reality itself. To her, it was compartmentalized. Separate interactions. Separate meanings. Controlled boundaries. To me, it was one continuous collapse. And neither of us was willing, or able, to step into the other's version long enough to reconcile it. So instead of resolution, we just stopped translating altogether. Moving out didn't feel like a dramatic exit. There was no final confrontation that gave closure, no last-minute emotional collapse that made everything make sense. It was logistical. Quiet. Almost embarrassingly practical. Boxes appeared over days. Clothes folded without ceremony. Drawers emptied without discussion. It felt less like ending a marriage and more like dismantling a shared storage unit we had both forgotten how to use properly. She watched most of it without commenting. Occasionally she'd ask something neutral, like whether I needed a box or if I was taking the lamp. Small, functional questions that avoided anything resembling emotional acknowledgement. At one point, she said, almost casually, "You're making this into something it doesn't have to be." And I remember stopping mid-pack, holding a stack of books, realizing she genuinely believed that. Not as manipulation. Not even as denial. But as her actual internal framing of the situation. That was almost harder than the betrayal itself. Because it meant we weren't just in disagreement. We were operating under completely incompatible definitions of consequence. When I finally closed the last box, there was no final look around. No dramatic pause. Just a strange emptiness that didn't feel like grief yet, but something delayed. She didn't stop me as I left. I didn't ask her to. The hallway felt longer than I remembered. Or maybe that was just the silence catching up. And for the first time, I understood that leaving wasn't a moment. It was an absence that would continue unfolding long after the door closed. Months passed, but the story didn't really end. It just stopped having new events and started becoming memory, which is somehow more persistent. I still find myself reconstructing it at odd times. Not because I want to go back, and not even because I miss her specifically, but because my brain keeps trying to resolve what it couldn't understand while it was happening. The hardest part is the instability of meaning. I replay conversations and realize how many interpretations each moment could have held depending on what I now know. A sentence that sounded casual then feels calculated now. A silence that felt normal then feels loaded in hindsight. But I also know memory is unreliable that way. It reshapes itself to match the ending you eventually reach. That's what makes it dangerous. Sometimes I wonder if she experienced the same fragmentation, just from the opposite direction. If, in her version of events, she wasn't hiding multiple parallel connections, but simply living them without assigning them the same weight I did. That thought doesn't excuse anything. It just complicates it further. Because then the question becomes not just what happened, but whether we were ever interpreting the same relationship at all. I don't romanticize it. I don't want it back. But I also don't fully reduce it to betrayal in the clean, simple way people like to summarize things. It was messier than that. More distributed. Less centered around a single moment, and more around an ongoing mismatch in how reality itself was being categorized. And that kind of confusion doesn't end when the relationship ends. It just follows you into quieter rooms. There isn't a clean ending to this. No final confrontation that ties everything together, no last confession that makes the previous years reorganize into something digestible. There is just distance. And time. And a kind of quiet recalibration of what trust even means after something like this. I still think about the gifts, but not in the way I used to. Not as symbols of betrayal alone. More like artifacts of a parallel system that was operating alongside the life I thought I was living. What haunts me isn't the objects themselves, but how ordinary they were in context. How easily they blended into a routine that I believed was stable. That's the part one can't fully reconcile. Because it means the signs weren't hidden. They were just interpreted differently by the person I trusted most. And that raises a question I don't have an answer for. How many realities can exist inside a shared life before it stops being shared at all? Some days I feel like I've moved on. Other days I realize I've just stopped expecting clarity from things that refuse to give it. And maybe that's the only resolution there is, not understanding everything, but learning to live without forcing it into a shape that feels comfortable. Still, every now and then, I catch myself remembering her not as she ended up being, but as she first appeared to me. And that version is the one that's hardest to let go of.